During the peak of the Soviet era, Russia, then the core of the Soviet Union, was one of the world's most formidable military powers. Thousands of military platforms were produced, all geared toward preparing for a potential conflict with the United States, though that clash never materialized. The aggressive Soviet leadership of that time could hardly have imagined that their successors would be forced to rely on equipment manufactured decades earlier, now well past its service life. Yet, that is the stark reality confronting Russia today. The price for this dependency is steep. With reserves depleted, Russia has had to deploy rusted, Soviet-era armored vehicles. Comment number 2 if you support Ukraine, number 3 if you support Russia, and number 4 if you love peace. Ukraine has destroyed nearly all of Russia's other equipment stocks. This is most evident in the Russian tank and armored fighting vehicle forces. On January 24, journalist David Axe wrote in Euromaidan Press that Russia managed to replace its entire lost armored fleet, but only once. Those replacements came from decaying Soviet-era storage depots. Now those stocks are exhausted. They have been burned up, just like most of the armored vehicles Russia has committed to Ukraine. With frontline armored strength now significantly weakened, it is only a matter of time before Russia's storage yards, once a ready source of replacements, stand empty, leaving nothing to offset the vehicles Ukraine continues to eliminate. At the outset, everything appeared favorable for Russia. When President Putin launched what he termed a special military operation, Russia held overwhelming numerical advantages across all fronts. In infantry fighting vehicles, IFVs, and armored personnel carriers, APCs, Russia entered Ukraine with a total of 13,842 platforms of these types. That figure should have enabled Russia to overwhelm Ukraine, especially if the Kremlin assumed Ukraine would respond to the invasion with a strategy aligned with Russia's attritional warfare style. That assumption proved disastrously wrong. Ukraine countered with asymmetric tactics, making it difficult for Russia to employ armored vehicles effectively, as will become clear. In the war's early years, however, Putin fully bet on Russia's approach, flooding the battlefield with masses of tanks, IFVs, and APCs to eventually shatter Ukrainian lines. Yet current outcomes reveal that Russia's armored fleet has been devastated, leaving it unable to dispatch reinforcements to replace what Ukraine will destroy next. The statistics make grim reading for Russia, even when limited to visually confirmed losses. These figures come from Oryx, an organization that tracks Russian military losses using only publicly available photographic or video evidence from open-source intelligence. Even with this conservative methodology, Oryx records Russia as having lost 4,308 tanks, along with 8,735 armored fighting vehicles, AFVs, and IFVs. For observers, the loss of nearly 9,000 AFVs and IFVs equates to roughly 2/3 of the total platforms of these types that Russia initially committed to Ukraine under Putin's invasion. These are only the confirmed losses. Oryx data alone would bring tears to Putin's eyes. Ukrainian claims suggest even higher figures for lost tanks and vehicles, implying even greater depletion of the reserves now under discussion. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense reported that, as of January 25, Russia had lost 11,605 tanks. For armored vehicles overall, the ministry stated Russia had lost 23,950 platforms. These are staggering numbers regardless of which source one credits. Even averaging the two yields the same conclusion. Russia's situation remains dire. The reality Putin faces is that the aging, rusting Soviet-era armored reserves he has fed into Ukraine are now depleted, while Russian production capacity falls far short of making up the shortfall. Czech military analyst Jakub Janovsky highlighted this in a post on X, noting that Russia's IFV and APC fleet is now in most regards approximately comparable or slightly larger to what the Russian military had operational at the start of the 2022 invasion. While this may sound like good news on the surface, it actually underscores the problem for Russia. They have exhausted storage reserves needed to sustain IFV and APC numbers. According to Euromaidan Press, confirmed annual losses now stand at around 2,400 vehicles, while production reaches only about 900 IFVs and APCs per year. This creates an annual deficit of 1,500 platforms, and again, these are Oryx figures, not Ukrainian ones that Russia must cover from Soviet-era armored stocks it no longer possesses. Axe provides further detail. He reports that Russia is producing tracked BMP-3 IFVs and wheeled BTR-82 APCs at rates of roughly 400 to 500 units per type annually. At best, Russia achieves 1,000 new IFVs and APCs per year, though the realistic figure is closer to 900. For losses tied to the Ukraine war, Russia has confirmed losses of 3,600 BMP-1 and BMP-2 IFVs from the 1960s and 1970s. Another 2,150 tracked MTLB APCs, also from the 1970s, have been destroyed. Even more modern Russian platforms have fared poorly. Ukraine has eliminated 1,900 of the BTR-82 seconds mentioned earlier, along with 890 BMP-3 seconds. Airborne BMD IFVs have not been spared, with confirmed losses of 700 units inflicted on Russian forces. The situation worsens when examining remaining stocks. A key phrase here is serviceable. According to Axe, Russia's serviceable Soviet-era BMP-1 and BMP-2 stocks in 2022 totaled around 4,900 units. Now only 1,110 remain serviceable. MTLB figures are similarly poor, dropping from 3,600 to 530. No BTR-82 seconds remain in storage from a prior high of 1,400, meaning all BTR-82 seconds now entering Ukraine come fresh from production lines that cannot meet demand. Russia also retains only 120 of the 460 BMDs it held at the invasion's start. The emphasis on serviceable is deliberate because Russia still holds thousands more IFVs and APCs in storage beyond these numbers. However, most of these decaying Soviet hulks are in such poor condition that the best Russia can do is cannibalize them for spare parts to sustain the shrinking pool of operational platforms. Repairing these derelict stocks is not cost-effective. It makes more sense to invest in new production, but Russia's limitations in that area are clear. In summary, Russia now has roughly 1,800 serviceable IFVs and APCs in storage, many likely requiring some level of repair. Production adds about 900 annually. Remember, these 1,800 are a one-time resource. Once gone, they are gone. Russia has lost between 2,250 and 5,980 armored vehicles per year in the Ukraine war, depending on whether one uses Oryx or Ukrainian Ministry of Defense data. No advanced math is needed to see these numbers do not add up. Even if Russia emptied every depot now, it would have perhaps 1 year of IFV and APC reserves before inability to replace ongoing losses sets in. That point will mark a sharp drop in these platform types in Ukraine, severely impacting Russia's territorial control capabilities there. But we will return to that issue later. First, the same problems afflicting Russia's IFVs and APCs also plague its tank stocks. As previously noted from Oryx and the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, 4,308 tanks confirmed lost by Oryx and 11,605 claimed by Ukraine. By October 2025, the New Voice of Ukraine reported that Russia had exhausted readily available tank reserves, though roughly 3,000 hulls could theoretically be restored. That is a modest number, especially if Ukrainian loss claims hold true. Once again, this represents roughly 1 year's supply of decrepit Soviet-era tanks, easy prey for Ukrainian drones. Axe estimates serviceable tank stocks at perhaps only 1,030 units. On production, Defense Express reported in November that Russia builds around 250 modern T-90M tanks annually, plus 150 T-80 BVMs, figures nowhere near sufficient to offset losses. From any angle, Russia's armored forces are collapsing. Within about a year, storage will be empty, forcing reliance on production facilities that cannot keep pace with losses in IFVs, APCs, and tanks sustained in Ukraine. Even if Russia miraculously replenished depleted Soviet armored stocks or ramped production to thousands annually, it would likely mean little for battlefield progress. The reason is straightforward. Possessing IFVs, APCs, and tanks holds limited value when Ukraine's asymmetric warfare tactics render them nearly unusable for their intended roles. Axe emphasized this in his Euromaidan press piece. Having vehicles on paper doesn't mean Russia can use them. Ukrainian mines, drones, and artillery make mechanized assaults nearly suicidal. He is correct. Russian troops increasingly distrust the armored vehicles provided by the Kremlin if they receive any at all. United 24 Media noted in a June article that many Russian armored platforms prioritize firepower over crew protection. The article cited the BMP-3 IFV discussed earlier. This platform mounts a 100mm main gun and a 30mm autocannon, potent weapons if Russian crews could close to effective range against Ukrainian positions, but they rarely can. Its armor is too thin to withstand Ukrainian mines and especially first-person view FPV drones. The same applies to other Russian armored vehicles. The BMP-2 has side and rear armor penetrable by heavy machine guns, with frontal armor only 16mm thick, less than 2/3 of an inch, a critical detail when a kamikaze drone bears down. The BTR-80 fares worse, with side armor just 7mm thick, vulnerable to heavy machine guns from around 500 meters. Imagine you are a Russian soldier. Your commander orders you and comrades aboard one of these vehicles to assault a Ukrainian position. The target lies kilometers away, across a vast kill zone laced with mines, drones, and possibly pre-positioned Ukrainian ambushes at choke points. Would you risk driving through that in a vehicle that anything stronger than a standard rifle round can shred like paper? Of course not. You might prefer to dismount and walk and soon realize why that too proves ineffective. We have already touched on the damage Ukrainian FPV drones can inflict, and they have become the single greatest barrier preventing Russia from meaningfully employing its remaining armored vehicles and tanks. A few recent incidents illustrate the point. On January 25, Ukrinform reported that Ukraine's unmanned systems forces destroyed 2 tanks and 29 vehicles in just 24 hours. That same day, Defense Express shared video of a Ukrainian FPV drone pursuing and repeatedly bombing a Russian turtle tank until it was destroyed. Note that this was no specialized vehicle. The turtle tank is Russia's makeshift response to the fact that most of its tanks date to the Soviet era. T-62 seconds and T-72 seconds are clad in crude welded armor slabs that add weight and reduce maneuverability in exchange for marginal drone protection. Most efforts prove ineffective. Ukraine simply deploys additional FPV drones to finish off one of these tanks. Desperation has become Russia's sole defensive form, evident in the substitute platforms deployed in Ukraine. As Axe observed, last year, Russian regiments largely kept their armored vehicles idle most of the time, instead advancing with infantry on foot, motorcycles, or even horseback. Lighter, smaller transports stand a better chance of evading overhead detection. Of course, a better chance of evasion does not equate to guaranteed success. Far from it. Russia's horseback assaults may attempt to evoke medieval ancestral spirit, but it means nothing when Ukrainian drones spot and dive. Russia tries to mask this desperate tactic behind a facade of bravery and reverence for courageous soldiers, surely not terrified to the point of soiling themselves, sacrificing on horseback. On January 7, Forbes reported that Russian media sought to praise the creativity of soldiers launching assaults against Ukrainian lines on horseback. It is a way to spin an alternate narrative. That Russia's decrepit armored vehicles are so useless that troops now stand a higher chance of success charging into battle on horseback. The fact that these cavalry assaults are routinely wiped out may not matter much to Putin. He and the Kremlin might even welcome it. At least a soldier dying on horseback does not waste an armored vehicle. Russia can no longer afford to lose. Horses are hardly a viable substitute for armored vehicles. This brings us to another major problem. Russia faces one already noted. Genuine breakthroughs into Ukrainian lines are impossible without the armored vehicles and tanks Russia has largely burned through. By genuine, we mean any advance faster than a snail's pace without suffering tens of thousands of Russian casualties along the way. Axe put it aptly. Armored vehicles remain the best means to rapidly exploit a breach in enemy lines. Russia's inability to deploy them for their intended purpose means that, absent a total Ukrainian collapse, the Kremlin has no way to break through. Instead, Russia resorts to small infantry unit assaults, with many troops attempting to advance on foot for gains of perhaps 1 kilometer at a time, if any progress occurs at all. The predictable result is Russia expending manpower at a terrifying rate. The Institute for the Study of War, ISW, underscored this in its December 31 assessment of Russia's campaign in Ukraine. According to ISW, Russia seized 5,304 square kilometers of territory in 2025, equivalent to about 2,048 square miles. Even this figure misleads somewhat, as 473 square kilometers, roughly 183 square miles, represent territory Russia reclaimed from Ukraine in Kursk, not gains in Ukraine proper. For these gains, Russia suffered 416,570 casualties. That equates to 78 casualties per square kilometer seized in Ukraine and Kursk, a core problem for the Kremlin. Russia has simply traded losing armored vehicles for losing soldiers. Both are finite resources. In its December 30 report, Mediazona indicated that Russia's 2025 was even worse than appearances suggest. While Russia claims a resurgent military poised to soon overwhelm Ukraine, its forces increasingly comprise older volunteers sent forward merely as cannon fodder against Ukrainian lines. Mediazona states Russia has formally shifted to a vehicle-conserving, manpower-expending strategy, further proof that armored reserves are as low as Axe claims. Regarding older men, Mediazona data drawn only from confirmed Russian losses via obituaries and official casualty reports shows the average age of Russian casualties approaching 50, with the most common age range for deaths in 2025 between 46 and 52. Sending middle-aged men to perform tasks, armored vehicles and tanks cannot seem to yield poor results for Putin. Russia has at least recognized this reality. According to Forbes, Russia has tested new tank tactics it believes offer higher success odds than prior methods. Currently, Russia pairs 2 tanks with a small drone team. Drones orbit, coordinate fire, and provide tanks with better situational awareness while tanks constantly reposition to fire without becoming fixed targets. Of course, Russia has yet to solve the issue that Ukrainian drone teams often operate beyond tank range, allowing FPV drones to strike and destroy tanks long before they near Ukrainian lines they aim to assault. If tank crews lack adequate supplies, food, fuel, ammunition, they can achieve little. Still, Russia is attempting adaptation. The effort appears too little and too late, doing nothing to offset massive IFV and APC losses. If anything, per Forbes, it adds strain to already overstretched logistics, suggesting the new strategy may prove unsustainable. While all this spells very bad news for Russia as it seeks progress in Ukraine without losing the remnants of its armored force, the problems extend to the future. Russia aims to rebuild a military strong enough to confront NATO, yet it cannot do so amid such heavy attrition. Fear is creeping into the Kremlin, as they know a certain European nation could derail Putin's future plans at any moment. Comment number 2 if you support Ukraine, number 3 if you support Russia, and number 4 if you love peace.